Remember? Yeah. So I wish I'd have thought of it. Well, anyway, speaking of clever moves, a little over a year ago, we decided to have a speaking deal, Before It's Too Late series. And so far, we've had 21 of you guys up here, and today will be number 22. I asked him for a bio. I tore away quite a few pages, and I finally ended up with this. Lou Martin was an Air Force pilot for 22 years, including 169 combat hours in Vietnam. He retired in 1970 as a lieutenant colonel. He later flew as a captain for the Japanese Airlines, a charter pilot in Iran, an FAA Inspector pilot. Lou is the author of 3 books. He made two trips to Moscow to assist a Russian startup airline. He holds a BS degree from the University of Maryland. He has a pilot certificate with the U.S., Japan, and Iran. 19,000 hours of flight, and he has his own aircraft. Lou is going to talk to us about some of his experiences when he was working for the FAA. He's really not qualified to get up here, but let's get him up here anyway. Lou Martin.
Thanks, Vince. Can you hear me now? Before I talk about my FAA, also I want to mention I'm not an extemporaneous speaker like Jim John, so I have to use a few notes, but I'm sure you'll bear with me. But before I talk about my time in the FAA, I want to tell you about this Baptist minister who retired after 60 years in a church in the hills of Mississippi, of Virginia, I guess it was, or Mississippi, doesn't matter. Anyway, he was given his final sermon, and the young minister that was going to replace him was sitting in the back to see if he could pick up any pointers. And the old minister, he started preaching this fire and brimstone speech, sermon, and he'd fill his glass with water and have a slug, go on talking and fill his glass again with water. He did this about 3 or 4 times, and he had people rolling in the aisles. And afterwards, the young minister came up and he said, "My gosh, that was really a tremendous sermon. I don't see how I'll ever be able to replace you." And the old minister, he said, "Well, since you're taking over my congregation, I'll let you in my little secret." He said, "Did you notice when I was preaching how often I drank water?" And the young minister said, "Yeah, I noticed that." He said, "But at least 3 or 4 times." He said, "Well, that's not water, that's gin." And he said, "I've learned over the years that I take a few slugs of gin, I can really preach." He says, "You can take that as a hint, but temper it a little bit." Well, the next Sunday, the young minister was giving his sermon. The old minister was sitting in the back, and he had the people rolling the aisle, hallelujah, waving their arms and so on. And after the service, the old minister said, "My God, you catch on fast." He says, "But you ought to temper your consumption with that water a little bit." He said, "You got a little carried away in your scripture." And the young minister says, "Well, can you give me a clue?" He says, "Well, yeah." He says, "David slew Goliath with a slingshot. He didn't stomp the shit out of him." That's a true story. Anyway, I was going to talk. I told Vince that Bob said I could only have about 2 hours, so when I see people falling asleep, I'll stop speaking. No, honestly, Bob, I have a stopwatch. Shouldn't be more than 30 minutes. I'm sure he's going to hold me to this. I was going to talk a little bit about my experiences, some of my experience with the FAA. And I want to say, prior to the signing of the 1978 Airline Deregulation Act, Civil Airlines Board control all aspects of the airline, including fares, routes, and even the number of airlines that were allowed to operate. However, their regulatory oversight was dreadfully inefficient. As an example, World Airways applied for permission to operate a low-fare flight between New York and Los Angeles. And after they studied it for 6 years, they disapproved it. So after the act became law, all CAB requirements were rescinded, and anyone with a little money and initiative could submit an application for an operating certificate to the FAA, which was to be the sole approving authority, along with the responsibility of ensuring compliance with safety regulations. I joined the FAA in New York soon after this act was signed. And since I had been an Air Force pilot for 22 years, flew for Japan Airlines, a charter pilot in Iran, and had 19,000 hours, the office manager said, I think you'd be a good candidate to work with startup airlines, which there were quite a few at the time. The first airline I worked with was New York Air, which utilized DC-9s up and down the East Coast. The airline was owned by Frank Lorenzo, you recognize the name, and operated in full compliance with FAA regulations. But they were harassed quite seriously by ALPA, since they were not part of their union. There were large pickets and even some vandalism that we were concerned about that may affect flight safety. But they survived, but they were finally incorporated, absorbed by Continental. I then assisted the certification of People's Express. This is one I mentioned to Dick Hill before he had his heart attack. Sorry, Dick. Where is he?
There.
There he is.
It wasn't a heart attack.
No, triple bypass.
Yeah.
Or
Anyway, the People's Express, they were operating 747s out of the Newark airport. And they came out with some unique ideas like accepting no reservations, tickets to be sold for cash only when on board the airplane, and charged for checked baggage, food, and drinks. They presented to the FAA, to our office, United Airline manuals, which we rejected because they're plagiarized documents. Our office manager got a call from Washington, said, don't worry about it, continue with the certification. During their first flight into JFK, the female captain became hopefully lost on the airport taxiways. And before she could be directed to the proper gate, airport ground traffic was really disrupted. On a flight from San Francisco to JFK, People's Express shut down an engine and went over Colorado. But the pilots did not have approach plates to the Denver area. Can you imagine that? The co-pilot borrowed some from a friend who worked for a different airline and was riding in the cabin as a passenger. They had only purchased navigational charts for the San Francisco and JFK area to save money. They also were later absorbed by Continental Airlines. The next airline I worked with is called Arista Airlines. It was an airline owned by a Nick Athens, a New York Greek. He leased 2 DCAs from SAS in Stockholm, Sweden, and hired qualified out-of-work U.S. pilots, flight engineers, and flight attendants. His goal was to support the tourist trade between New York and Athens. But many of the instruments in the aircraft, the leased aircraft, were in the metric system. And some idiot in Washington, when he heard that, he said that they'd all have to be converted into the English system. And I told the people in Washington that would be an unreasonable expense on the airline because they're leased. I was finally able to convince some bonehead in Washington that I'd provide charts so they could get a conversion chart between the metric and U.S. system so they could operate the aircraft safely, which was finally approved. As part of the training with Arista, I accompanied the pilots on a familiarization visit to an air traffic control radar site. This was just prior to the 1981 PATCO strike, and the air traffic controllers were becoming very militant. Our guide for this visit was an air traffic control supervisor who sported a full beard. He asked the Arista Airlines chief pilot, he said, can I and my air traffic controllers wearing beards, can we fly in your aircraft? And this chief pilot said, I don't see any problem. And he said, and I got a quote here. He said, good, because some airlines don't allow us to fly in their cockpits with beards. So in payback, we route them around the New York area for a time before allowing them to land, which costs them a lot of money and extra fuel, unquote. This is what a supervisor said. Stroking his beard, he then stated that since Boeing 747 captains make about $100,000 a year and controls only 1 aircraft, and he controls up to 4, his pay should be at least equal to a 747 captain. At the time, air traffic controllers were making up to $50,000 per year, which would be equal to about $117,000 today. But they were demanding a $10,000 a year salary increase, a 32-hour work week, and full retirement after only 20 years. After they went on strike, President Reagan gave them 48 hours to return to work. And when they didn't, he considered them in violation of their government contract not to strike and fired 11,300. During Arista's first proving flight, and I want to say just a word about proving flights. Anytime a startup airline starts flying, the FAA flies what we call proving flights or proving tests with only FAA personnel on board, no passengers. The same thing like when Northwest started flying the 747-400 or the A320, we'd have proving tests. But during Arista's proving flight to Athens, Greece, with only FAA and company personnel on board, I was surprised that after landing, the pilots had to ask directions to the Flight Operations Center and did not have proper ID to enter the ramp. There was some needless wandering around by lost pilots at the Athens airport. We were to be on the ground in Athens for 24 hours. And the CEO, Nick Athens, who spoke fluent Greek, said that he was going to take everyone on a bus tour of the city and a sit-down dinner in a fancy Greek restaurant in the port city of Piraeus. He also told me that he would pay for the FAA hotel rooms and our dinner. I had a hard time convincing him that as government employees, we would have to pay our own way. They sure love to get the government people in hock. The dinner was accompanied with lively Greek music and authentic male and female dancers, and everyone was having a wonderful time. At 9 p.m., I instructed the FAA inspectors to turn their glasses upside down and not accept any more free-flowing ouzo or wine. When Mr. Athens, the CEO, noted that our glasses were overturned, he asked me if there was a problem. I told him no, I didn't have a problem, but that their pilot's operations manual stated 12 hours between throttle and bottle, and that they had planned for a 9 a.m. departure the following morning, that it was now 9:30, and his pilots were still partying, drinking, and dancing with Greek women. Hearing this, he called everyone's attention by ringing a fork in the glass and stated that the party was over, everyone should head for the bus, and they were charged changing the departure time to 10 a.m. I enjoyed working with Nick Adams and Arista Airlines, but they overextended their operation. They even flew to Minneapolis for a while. But they finally went bankrupt. But before they did, I was able to enjoy a discounted flight to Athens and a tour of the Greek islands with my wife. We paid for it. The next airline I worked with, this is kind of interesting, was called Novice in Puerto Rico. It was to be a low-budget airline that planned to operate between New York and Puerto Rico. The owner was a large New York Puerto Rican who spoke with a booming voice through a heavy Spanish accent and a thick black mustache. He was a likable person, but possessed limited cash and knew nothing about the airline business. He purchased a used Boeing 707, had it painted, refurbished, and inspected at his expense. He hired some qualified pilots, flight engineers, and flight attendants, and fulfilled all our requirements for a certificate. On the day that he was to fly his first proving flight, this is interesting, on the day that he was to fly his first proving flight to Puerto Rico with only FAA inspectors on board, he was waiting for me in my office at 7:30 a.m. In his heavily accented, booming voice, he said, quote, "Lou, I need your help. A sheriff arrived early this morning with a Boeing 707 flight crew and a court order stating that they were repossessing my aircraft for an outstanding debt." He continued, he says, while I watched in horror, they cranked up the aircraft engines and took off, unquote. He showed me a copy of the court order and wanted to know if there was anything that I could do to save his airline. I shared in his disappointment, but pointed out that obviously he didn't go to the expense of a title search on the aircraft before he purchased it, and that there was nothing I could do. This was the end of Aero Novice to Puerto Rico without a single flight after spending several $100,000. The most notorious startup airline that I worked with was called Guy America, which planned and operating Boeing 707s between New York and Georgetown, Guyana, and international on-call charter flights. The CEO was a New York Italian by the name of Tony Terry, and his chief pilot was a hard-nosed South African by the name of Peter Van Wyck. I first met Mr. Van Wyck when he visited our office to submit an application for an operating certificate. During our discussion, he became very vociferous when I outlined the FAA training requirements that his pilots, flight engineers, and flight attendants would have to undergo. He stood up while shouting that he was hiring fully qualified crew members and that the FAA requirements were excessive and stupid, and that he wouldn't agree to them. When I heard that, without saying a word, I closed my folder, left the room, and returned to my desk. A few minutes later, the front desk secretary called and said that Mr. Van Wyck was still in the conference room and wanted to know when I would return to continue our discussion. I told the secretary to inform Mr. Van Wyck that our business for that day was over and that when he learned to conduct himself in a civil manner, he could call for another appointment. A few days later, when he returned, he controlled his temper and reluctantly agreed to the FAA requirements. He contracted with American Airlines in Dallas-Fort Worth to conduct their ground school. And on the first day of training, I was sitting in the classroom with about 20 pilots and flight engineers. An American Airlines ground school instructor started explaining the structure of an operations manual, which everyone had a copy of except me. During the coffee break, I told Captain Van Wyck that to follow their training, I needed a copy of the operations manual myself. His comment, quote, "Operation manuals are expensive, Martin, and I didn't plan on providing you with one," unquote. In a firm, reciprocal voice, I told him that if there wasn't a Guy America operations manual on my desk at the end of the coffee break, I would be on the first flight back to New York and they would not receive FAA credit for their training. When I returned to my chair, there was an operations manual sitting on my desk. Guy America finally received their operating certificate, and that's when the fun began. During a Guyana steel band party in Queens, New York, the CEO told me that they planned on purchasing a used Boeing 707 in Transylvania for $200,000 and requested that we send an FAA operations and maintenance inspector there to inspect it. The going price for a good 707 at that time was about $500,000. I told him that he should contact a designated airworthiness inspector or representative of DAR in Europe to perform this service. His response, quote, "This would cost money, Martin," unquote, and the subject was dropped. About a week later, he said that the Boeing 707 that they had purchased in Transylvania was sitting on the ramp in JFK, and he wanted our office to perform a conformity inspection so they could add it to their operating certificate. Who flew that airplane to New York? I don't know. We never did find out. But an airworthiness inspector and I were looking over the aircraft with him checking the outside and me in the cockpit. A short time later, he said that he wanted to show me something in the right wheel area. He pointed to a section of the exposed main spar coated with Bondo body filler and painted gray. He was able to shove a lead pencil up through the Bondo and into the main spar itself, which was soft because of massive corrosion. We grounded the aircraft and left it sitting on the ramp. A few weeks later, the CEO informed us that he had sold the aircraft to the Air Force at a profit to be used as spare parts of their KC-135s. However, to complete the deal, he said he'd have to ferry it to Miami. So we issued him a one-time ferry permit requiring that he take off runway 13 right at JFK, which is over the water, and then he ferried the airplane over the Atlantic Ocean en route to Miami. We didn't want a wing to fall off over some residential area. The pilots for Guy America, I gotta take some gin.
Sounds like it.
I see the worm in the bottom of the bottle.
Now we can go. Fire and brimstone. The pilots for Guy America were always complaining that when they were not receiving their full salary. It was kind of a carrot and stick approach to ensure that they would not quit, since they were always owed a portion of their pay. However, one day, the aircraft mechanics went on a strike stating that they would not turn another wrench unless they were paid in full. They were lined up in a hangar and paid off. Now this is true. They were paid off in moldy, musty, smelling $100 bills. I don't think the money came from a bank. It was obviously dug up from some hole in the ground. But they started working. One day when I was making a routine visit to their dispatch office, I noted that their Jepson approach and navigation charts were 4 months out of date. The dispatcher said that he was aware of it, but that I should talk to the CEO. After confronting him, his response was, quote, "Jepson charts are expensive, Martin," unquote. Guy America had acquired another Boeing 707, but before we were able to inspect it and add it to their operating certificate, it was on its way to Australia on a charter flight. When I confronted the CEO on this obvious violation, he did not seem concerned. I told him that the flight would probably encompass 7 leg segments, and the most fine we could impose would be $1,000 for each flight, but that I figured he made a profit of around $46,000. His comment, quote, "Your figures are pretty close, Martin," unquote. However, I told him that although he was able to escape us this time, he was building a record that he could not be proud of. Because of their nefarious operation, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosive personnel became interested, but no drugs were found. But I suspected an illegal operation. My wife had received phone calls stating that her husband should go easy in dealings with Guy America, so as a precaution, I started keeping a loaded shotgun in my closet. By the spring of 1983, we had 1,000 violations logged against the airline and decided to revoke their operating certificate in federal court. They hired a high-priced New York lawyer to fight the action, and I was on the witness stand on and off for 5 days. Their lawyer was in, quote, in-your-face type, and I had to ask Judge Fowler to order him several times to address me in a well-mannered distance in a reasonable tone of voice. My complaints were ignored until I told the judge that not only was his approach insulting, but that his halitosis was making me sick. We won the case and revoked their certificate. When I was transferred to the Minneapolis FAA office in the summer of 1983, it was a real treat to deal with compliance-oriented airlines. In the process, in Minneapolis, I served at various times as the Chief FAA Inspector for Misalba, Viking, Sun Country, Republic, and then finally Northwest Airlines. Some years later, an FAA friend ran into the Guy America CEO in Puerto Rico, and for some reason, my name came up. He fired back with, quote, "Is that SOB Lou Martin still working for the FAA?" Unquote. But having the status of my birth questioned when working for the FAA was not the last time it occurred. It was also questioned after my name was associated with the investigation of a World War II V24 joining up with the Northwest 747 passenger flight approaching Minneapolis. You all remember that one. The captain of the 747 was completing his final flight before reaching the mandatory retirement age of 60. When I arrived in my office at 7:30 a.m. on Monday, July 13, 1998, the Northwest Airlines chief pilot called and wanted to know if I was sitting down. He then told me that a World War II B-24 had formed up on a Northwest 747 flight from Osaka, Japan, as it approached Minneapolis the day before. He said that the B-24 had approached the 747 from the rear and remained in formation on its right side through radar vectors and a low approach to runway 12 left. He thought that the join-up was made without prior arrangements with the 747 captain, but that he was still obtaining crew statements and ordering CBR and Toronto radio tapes. I told him that I would be in his office in about 10 minutes to discuss it. As I was preparing to leave, my secretary said that I had a phone call from Washington. An FAA headquarters staff member said that the administrator, I don't know how they heard about it, said that the administrator had heard about a World War II V24 joining up on a 747 passenger flight about to land in Minneapolis and wanted a full report. I told him that I was on my way to Northwest Airlines and would call them back ASAP. Looking into the incident, like Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. Looking into the incident uncovered many surprises. A Northwest staff member had coordinated the join-up with the Minneapolis tower, but did not inform the Northwest chief pilot. I think I know why. He wouldn't have approved it. He told the tower chief that the B-24 could not take off unless all the passenger seats were sold, but that Northwest Airlines was willing to purchase the unsold seats to ensure that the flight took place. He also stated that they were hoping to launch a B-17 and a Mooney chase plane to take pictures. The main FAA concerns stated were, one, the possibility of the B-24 flying into wake turbulence generated by a slow-flying heavy 747 in a high angle attack. If this had occurred, it was possible that the B-24 could have been exposed to structural damage of catastrophic proportions. Two, the B-24 did not receive separate ATC clearance to enter Class B airspace. And three, the flying in formation with passengers for hire on board, 373 in the 747, and several of the B-24, which had paid $2,000 fee to Colliers. The Collins Group stated in a letter to the FAA that the pilots in both aircraft were aware of and briefed on the planned join-up. However, the Northwest 747 captain stated that he was not aware of the planned flight. Both pilots stated that the flight was not a formation. Again, like Paul Harvey says, the rest of the story. Both pilots stated that the flight was not a formation, yet when the B-24 pilot contacted the tower, he stated that they were a flight of two and planned a 200-foot low pass over the airport. When questioned on how he was allowed to enter Class B airspace without individual permission and why he turned off his transponder, he said that he felt his aircraft was in formation with the Northwest 747. The 747 first officer stated that he was not briefed on the planned join-up and that the B-24 passed behind their left wing and came up on their right side. He stated that he was so concerned about the operation that he thought about taking over command of the aircraft, but discounted it when he noted how calm and unconcerned the captain was. The flight engineer stated that he was very surprised and angry that he was not briefed on the planned join-up on a passenger flight arriving in Minneapolis during a very busy period. When approaching, this is interesting, when approaching Minneapolis, the lead flight attendant made the following cabin announcement, quote, "For passengers sitting on the right side of the aircraft, you may see a World War II boomer." That's the way she pronounced it. "You may see a World War II boomer flying next to us," unquote. This announcement must have terrified some older Japanese passengers. You know, I understand the honor that this flight was intended to convey to the retiring captain. But in hindsight, it was a poorly orchestrated operation that generated a lot of unintended bad publicity for Northwest Airlines and for the FAA headquarters in Washington. Due to the flight's interest, I found myself, metaphorically speaking, like a traffic cop having to book a friend going 60 miles per hour in a school zone. I believe being called an unfriendly name was to be expected by persons not aware of the circumstances surrounding the incident, since my name was plastered all over the FAA enforcement package. However, the situation, of course, could have been much worse, since the B-17 and the Mooney chase plane had been canceled. Oh, God. I often wondered why I didn't call in sick that day. The FAA legal department recommended a 60-day certificate suspension for the two pilots on the B-24, but no action against retired Captain Fred Owens. However, the suspension was held in abeyance when it was appealed in the federal court. I had already retired when the case came up, but was recalled to active duty as a witness. One of their character witnesses, I don't know where they got them, one of their character witnesses employed to substantiate that the flight was not a formation flight was Air Force General Steve Ritchie. Remember him? Air Force General Steve Ritchie, an F-4 Vietnam War ace. So if we have time, I want to tell you a little bit about a typical fighter pilot, about his position on the witness stand. When investigating the incident, I had the full cooperation of the Northwest Airlines chief pilot, who wanted it quickly resolved. He said that they had received several written and verbal passenger complaints and that he was in a quandary as to how to answer them. The director of operations pointed out that 373 passengers had purchased a ticket from Osaka to Minneapolis. And after a 12-hour flight, they sensed that the aircraft was prepared to land. The seatbelt sign was on, seats were in the upright position, tray tables were stowed, and the flight attendants were making their final check. Again, according to the director of ops. But as the aircraft continues descent, there was a confusing cabin announcement of the World War II boomer on the right side, followed by changing engine sounds, the gear and flaps extending, and the houses and automobiles growing larger as they continued their descent. Since there was no further cabin announcement, the passengers were expecting the aircraft to be in its final landing pattern. Instead, to their surprise, it flew over the airport at, to them, a dangerous low altitude and high speed. It then made a climbing turn to the left, followed by the unfamiliar circling pattern to a landing. He said that some passengers were upset over the unorthodox approach, while others were confused and some even frightened, thinking that the aircraft was in trouble and may crash. One woman stated in a letter to Northwest that she was scared during the low approach and was praying that she would live to see her grandchildren. I think that quite often that we who live and breathe aviation underestimate the apprehension and fear of some white-knuckled passengers have about flying. I made this mistake myself some years ago when I exposed my wife to formation flying in my 150. I didn't brief her that a friend of mine was going to join up on the left, and when the flight was over, I looked over and she was white as a ghost. She thought she was going to die. It was my error, and after that she said, "I'm not going to fly with you anymore," which she doesn't to this day. Another error caused by a DC-9 pilot when there was an air show going on in Eau Claire. They disrupted the air show for a few minutes while he could make a landing, and he told the air boss, he said, "I'm going to make a low flyby of the air show." So he made a low flyby about 250 knots at 200 feet across the airport in Eau Claire. And they received many passenger complaints about that, but no cabin announcement made. So sometimes we get carried away with what we're trying to do. I recognize that the violations against the B-24 pilots were weak, but they provided Northwest Airlines with the material to show concerned passengers that the FAA was looking into the matter, and that this type of landing approach would not be flown in the future. The violations, the reason they were weak, we had to show something, and we had to give Northwest something to answer the passenger complaints. But the definition of formation is very weak, and the Airman's Manual is like what the definition of is. So you don't really know. So that was, the Judge Fowler threw that out. When that was thrown out, of course, that killed the violation against carrying passengers in formation for hire. And the wake turbulence was hypothetical, and there was no proof to it. Now, I got something I want to show you, not this hat. When I retired, well, I can get the mic here. When I retired, it was kind of humbling. There was a party over in the officers club, and the dining room was completely full. I think most of the people there were glad to see me leave. But it was a nice party, and Northwest presented me with a laser printed plaque, a big B-747 model, and this picture. It's a composite picture of a B-24 joining up on a 747 in Northwest. And the DO that gave me this picture, he made quite a deal, and it says, "Good luck, Captain Lou Martin, for your friends and from your friends in flight operations." I'm going to pass this around. It's something. That hangs at my heroes wall down in the basement. It's quite a sensation. 30 minutes. I mentioned proving test. I want to tell you just about why I mentioned why these proving tests are made before the airline is allowed to carry passengers. And when Northwest brought in the 747-400, we were making a flight from Minneapolis to Tokyo, and then from Tokyo to Los Angeles. And everything was going pretty well. But we were jetting across the Pacific hour after hour, and I was in the first class section going over my notes to see if I'd covered everything. I was the team leader. And I looked over at the elevator. The 747-47, there's an elevator between the lower area and the upper area used for serving meals. And I went in and looked at that elevator, and there's a sign in the elevator that said the elevator must be fully down and locked for takeoff and landing. And of course it's electric. And anything electric can fail. So I thought, ha-ha. So I sat down, I wrote out a note to the captain. I said, "You're preparing to land at Los Angeles, and the elevator is stuck in the up position. The switches don't work, and we checked the circuit breakers, and they're all in." So I handed that note to the captain. He said, "No problem." He pulled out his flight operations manual and started leafing through it. Couldn't find anything. And so he spent some time, we were in no hurry, we were just jetting across the Pacific. So he called the lead flight attendant. And he told her about the problem. Oh, she said, "I'll get my flight attendant's manual." So she came up and she was leafing through her flight attendant's manual. She said, "I can't find anything about that." Well, also on the airplane, there were 3 Boeing engineers. But they're not allowed, or the Northwest people, to interfere with the crew unless they get permission from the FAA, because we want to let the crew handle it. So I noticed these Boeing engineer guys were kind of antsy. And I said, "You can't say a word." So the lead flight attendant and the captain were trying to figure out what the hell to do. And I just let them no hurry. So after a while I said, "Okay, you Boeing guys, you know how to solve the problem?" They said, "Sure, follow us." So we went back to the elevator, a little spring clip. They push that spring clip, and the door opens, and in there is a crank that unfolds, so you can crank the elevator up and down. But there was no sign, there was nothing in the manual. So anyway, I just want to mention, this is why we have proving tests. So of course, to fix, we added an addition to the pilot's manual and the flight attendant's manual, and there's a placard there. In case the electrical system fails, they can crank it up and down, but nobody thought of that. The other one I want to mention is kind of interesting, about the A320. We were doing proving tests in the A320 when they brought it into service, and we were flying back from Los Angeles. And I was sitting up in the first class section, going over my notes, and I heard this crash. And I looked up, the flight attendant pulling out a coffee pot from the coffee maker. Of course, it's metal. She dropped it, maybe it was too hot, and it crashed to the floor. Didn't break, of course, because it was metal. And I stood up. The thing I was interested in, that full pot of coffee was running down through the floor. What's underneath that is an electronics bay. And that airplane is a fly-by-wire aircraft that operates off of 7 computers. And all this coffee was running down into a lower compartment. So after we got on the ground, we went into that compartment, and sure enough, coffee was still dripping down over all these computers. What the Airbus had to fix, these are just panels on the floor that they lay down. What the Airbus engineers hadn't thought of is if somebody spills coffee or liquid, it can run down. Now the fix was very simple. It was just a rubber shielding around like you put on a storm window around all those compartments to prevent that. But if that flight attendant hadn't dropped that coffee pot, we never would have known that. So that's, working for the FAA was very interesting, but I'm glad I did it. Any questions? And my time now is 35 minutes. That's what I told Bob it'd be 2 hours, but it's only 35 minutes. Any questions about anything? I'd be glad to either answer them or avoid them, whatever you want. Yeah. Yes.
We were just talking, I'm sure some of you guys saw it last night, where this Airbus 380 ran into a Comair commuter jet over in Kennedy.
No, I wasn't there.
Well, it was, I'm sure you'll see it on the news sooner or later, and there was a discussion about who's at fault. Was it the pilot of the 380 or the pilot of the Comair or the ground control or whatever?
Well, Spook's question was about that Comair and A380 accident in JFK yesterday. Personally, I knew something like that was going to happen. That airplane was so damn big. It's 368 wingspan. We can't operate that airplane in Minneapolis because we don't have the jetways. We'd have to spend a couple $100 million to accommodate it. So the airplane to me is too damn big. If they equip the airplane with accompanying seats only, they can they can carry up to 800 people. Can you imagine 800 people with checked baggage problem? If a security breach and everybody has to offload it. So I knew that was going to happen, Scoot. The captain, I say maybe unfortunately, is going to be ultimately responsible, but the tower is going to share into it. If we got time, I want to mention back in Dick.
Did you have any involvement with that Lockheed 1011 in Everglades with the Feller engine?
No, that was before my time in this area. But I wanted to mention, this would have been the late 80s, when Northwest 747, taxiing out in Stockholm, Sweden, had clipped the vertical stabilizer on the SAS DC-9, just cut it off by the side. I was called, because I was the chief inspector for Northwest, and I called Frankfurt and I said, can you send them an inspector up there? They said no. I called Brussels and they said they can't send an inspector up there. So I jumped on an airplane the next morning and flew to Stockholm and worked for 5 days with the Swedes. The captain, unfortunately, again, or fortunately, was at fault. He had not listened to the ATIS properly. He had taxied down a closed taxiway. And listening to the cockpit voice recorder, they were aware that they were close to the DC-9, the SAS DC-9, because the first officer on the cockpit voice recorder says you can't come over any further to the right, you'll be off the taxiway. And they clipped off the vertical stabilizer of the SAS DC-9. It was an obvious violation against the captain. We issued a 60-day suspension of a certificate. They don't lose an awful lot of money the way they run the schedule, but he was at fault. Now, fast forward about a year or so, I had made an inspection trip on a check ride to Honolulu. And I was coming back to Minneapolis, and I was in the dispatch center, and I told him I was going to ride in the cockpit of this DC-10. And the dispatcher says, fine, the captain will be here very shortly. The captain walked in. I'd never met him personally. But the dispatcher told him, Mr. Martin is going to ride with you to Minneapolis. He said, Mr. Lou Martin? And the dispatcher said, yes. He says, not in my airplane, he isn't. So, they can't deny access to the FAA and the airplane. So I went over to the captain quietly. He was working in his ear. I said, Captain, you've already had one violation that I was in charge of. I said, I'm sure you don't want another one. It's going to be much more serious. I said, you can't deny me access on this aircraft. He says, well, it's going to be a quiet cockpit. Anyway, I flew back to Minneapolis. Any other questions? Because I got to shut up here before Bob gives me the hook. All right, thank you very much.
Isn't it amazing in World War II that all the accidents on the ground and the air, they didn't have any investigations? I remember the first one I saw at Sioux City, Iowa. B-17 was taking off and they cleared another B-17 to cross the runway. 10 men on each one, loaded with 50 caliber machine gun shells because they were going to out to shoot gunnery practice. And no investigation at all. Within 10 minutes, we had to take off right behind us. But it's a good thing we didn't have to investigate all of those.
Yeah.
Lucky we Thanks, Lou.
Lucky we didn't have Lou Martin then.
That SOB, Lou Martin?
But you didn't have any paying passengers.